All right. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Maria. Thanks, everybody out there in webinar land for being back with us. It's great to be here with you again. Just a reminder, quicker now since we're in week 3 of the course, to use the Q&A function anytime you have a question. If you want to introduce something into the conversation, I will do everything I can to receive that and address that over the course, especially in the Q&A toward the end of the session. So keep using that. And it's great to be back with you all. As you know, today, we're going to take on the 3rd chapter of Laudato Si, the human roots of our ecological crisis. And, before we get into that, we're going to open up with group insights and discussion here from the people in our seminar group. Before we do that, I just wanted to mention a couple of works by an author, because I did hear that people appreciated the reading suggestions and things like that we were doing. And many of you know Dr. Elizabeth Johnson, of formerly, retired from Fordham University, who we mentioned before, was both my mentor and a member of the community that is sponsoring this group, this session. And so she came up several times last week, and I didn't want to get away without offering a recommendation of 2. There are many works, but 2 of her works in particular on this subject. The first one is Ask the Beasts, Darwin and the God of Love, which was published a few years ago. And the second one is an older work, but is really sort of a seminal work in the conversation about ecological theology, and especially about the relationship between ecological theology and feminist theology. And that's that second one, Women, Earth, Creator, Spirit. They're both readily available in bookstores and various places where we get our books. And so if you want further reading on these things, those are both excellent works of ecological theology that can be a way into these conversations. So as we're talking reading suggestions, I'm sure more will come up as we go. I wanted to put those into the mix. So there you have it.
Thank you.
All right. So to get us started today, I wanted to open it up, as we did last week, to our seminar group to offer any questions, reflections, observations, responses, whatever it might be that you have kind of on your mind, in your heart, wherever it is, as we enter into this conversation of chapter 3, this discussion of the human roots of the ecological crisis. So we'll take a few minutes, open it up to the room, hear from a few people about what they're bringing in to the conversation, and we'll use that as a seedbed for the discussion to come. So the floor is open to anybody here in our seminar group who'd like to jump in with an observation or a question or an insight.
I would, if that's okay. It's Bonnie.
Yes, Bonnie.
From 105 toward the end, and he says, in this sense, we stand naked and exposed in the face of our ever-increasing power, lacking the wherewithal to control it. I thought, wow, that was really powerful.
Yeah, there are quite a few sort of like jabs in here that really get at the heart of things. And I guess, Bonnie, as a follow-up to that, I assume that it's striking you because you see it as sort of an accurate diagnosis of the situation. Where do you see that? How do you see that kind of playing out in real life?
Oh my gosh. Everywhere. Where don't you see it? Well, right now, the Ukraine, that would be an example of it, that really just completely oblivious.
Absolutely. And I think what you said there, when you said everywhere, where do you not see it, right? That's really important to recognize, because what we'll see as we kind of dive in later on today is that, Pope Francis's argument is really an argument about what we would call a systematic or systemic or structural reality. This whole thing about the technocratic paradigm, it's not just about the way that business works or the way that the tech industry works or those kinds of things. It's about the whole way that our society is structured. And then the way that structuring incentivizes, asks us, invites us to take on certain kinds of behaviors which carry with them these very exploitative and destructive consequences, right? So it's a systematic, a structural, societal kind of thing that he's talking about. And so you're absolutely right. I mean, in some ways, the answer to the question, the best answer to the question, where do you see this exploitative sort of nakedness. We are exposed in the nakedness of our power. Where do you see that? We do see it everywhere because it pervades our systems. And that's really the underlying problem that he's trying to get at. So I'll say more about that as we go forward, but that's great. Maria, please.
Yeah, there was so much to comment on in this chapter, but the one thing that struck me is he talked about, and this is just part of the sentence, as if reality, goodness, and truth automatically flow from technological and economic power. And I was thinking about how superficial human beings are. You know, if it's a new car, a new thing, a new that, whatever it is that's new, it's got to be good and better. As if all of those things, and then he goes on to talk about, you know, there's no commensurate human responsibility, values, and conscience that have been developed along with this. So that was just the one that struck me the most out of many things here.
Absolutely. Also out of paragraph 105 there, right? We're in the
correct
there. And that's one of the quotes that struck me too. It's in my notes and I'll refer to it later on as well. But, you know, I love that as if, because again, speaking of kind of really telling the truth and jabbing us with it, I mean, here Francis is saying we act as if, right? This unchecked economic growth and, you know, technological power automatically flow, you know, goodness and truth automatically flow from these. And the implication is they don't, you know, because there isn't that accompanying moral responsibility, that accompanying ethical sensibility that says, okay, what is this economic growth for? What is this technological power for? Right. And so we need those checks and balances kind of in place as we think with this too. And we'll talk a lot about that going forward. So we've got 3 Zoom hands up in a line. We'll go to those folks in order. So Barbara, please.
My thought was when he names the central condition of anthropocentrism, it's the very characteristic of us that's going to make it, or that makes it impossible for us to see ourselves. So it's as though we're trying to talk to, and I hesitate to use an analogy here because I don't want to offend, but it's as though if we were unable to see and somebody kept saying, well, if you would just consider this and just look at this and just look in the mirror at this, we can't. So the problem is huge. How will we come to acknowledge this basic condition?
Excellent. That's so good because, and what I think is so fascinating, almost ironic about that, right, is that the conditions that make anthropocentrism possible are this sort of overestimation of the human capability, the overestimation of what we humans are and what we're capable of through science and technological progress and all these things. And so on the one hand, we're almost overstating, this is who we are is our power, who we are is what we are capable of doing. But in doing that, we actually lose the sense of who we are truly created to be, who we truly are as God's beloved creatures standing among creatures, right? To use one of Elizabeth Johnson's phrases, since I mentioned her, you know, in a community of creation that encompasses the whole, right, of the cosmos and not just us. You know, it's not just about us, our needs, especially not my individual needs and wants and things like that. So it's so interesting that like anthropocentrism is all about like this exaggerated sense of what it means to be human, exaggerated so much so that the whole value center of the universe is little old us as Homo sapiens, our species. But in reality, what we're doing is exposing the fact, as you said, Barbara, that we don't know who we are and we're not living according to our God-given vocation. And I think that that's really there under the surface, kind of right there as the central problem that this chapter is driving at. That's a really wonderful insight as well. Thank you. Go to Judy next.
Thank you. Hi. I was really challenged by this chapter because we are so immersed in technology. You know, he even says something about countercultural lifestyle would be to put it on hold. But when he talks about that, the technical products aren't neutral and they condition our lifestyles. And and they're conditioned according to the interests of the rich and powerful. And I hadn't thought about it, but I thought that's really true, and it's really scary. And you know, this chapter also talks about how technology has moved us away from our role as collaborators with God in creation, and moved us to a place where we've surrendered to the technology to account the dignity of people and the suffering that people are exposed to now in the interest of technology. And I think of like the copper mining in the Congo, you know, the children doing this mining so that we can all walk around with our smartphones, and how they're being exposed to this poison all the time. And there's no sense of value, or which has been said before, you know, there's no, we've forgotten, or at least the tech providers, there's no sense of value statements or that move their product. It's all about wealth.
Yeah.
And the advancement. And in this section, Pope Francis calling for a bold cultural revolution, which I thought was a really, you know,
absolutely.
it is. It's what we need, because, but it challenged me to think, how am I immersed in technology that I don't even think about? And I need to think about that. I need to think about the people behind my products. I need to think about the products that I'm using that I don't really need to.
That's excellent. Yeah, and he uses this term. He doesn't really elaborate on it too fully, but he uses this term real cost at one point. And I'll say some things about what that means. Yeah, to incorporate, you know, the actual sort of reality of what's there. You know, in the classical sort of example, Karl Rahner, the Jesuit theologian, famously, you know, uses the banana, buying a banana as the example of this problem. I think you mentioned this in our first session. But, you know, if you really look at what is going on when you purchase a banana from a supermarket and run that all the way back up the supply chain, all the way back up the production chain, the moral and ethical issues that emerge make it almost impossible to ever feel like it could ever be ethical to, you know, buy a banana again. And if there are any fans of the show The Good Place out there, you know, there are some great connections here with, I don't want to like spoil anything, but The Good Place is a great reflection on some of this stuff, especially as it kind of moves toward its conclusion. So it's a little side note there, pop culture kind of thing that you might check out as well. Yeah, and I think that this is great. You know, Bonnie's comment in the chat there, as consumers, we need to investigate the companies that provide services we choose to use, right? And I think what you were getting at, Judy, that's so important, again, that we'll talk a little bit more about as we go forward, is that technology in its pure form, right, in its sort of like basic form, is just tools. Technology is meant to be just a tool that makes us able as humans, or makes maybe creation as a whole able to do what it is already able to do more efficiently, to enhance our ability or to enrich our ability to do X, Y, or Z. That's what technology is supposed to do. So it has this capacity, Francis says, to serve the common good of the whole creation. But in practice, it rarely does that. And what we really see going on, right, is that our consumption of technology, our rapid consumption, remember that concept rapidification from chapter 1, right? Our rapid consumption of technology and our sort of assumption, you know, that it's just okay to use, and this is just what we're doing. And here we are on Zoom, right? We think about these things, right? Easily changes our culture in ways that we are not aware of. We don't notice the cultural shifts happening all the time. Although if we stop to reflect, I think we can see them. We often don't notice the way that our whole society and our assumptions about what's right and wrong and good and bad and moral or ethical or whatever it is, the way that those are changing alongside these developments in technology. And that's sort of a deeper level of analysis that this chapter really gets at. And so I really appreciate that as a way in as well. Great. So we'll take one last comment to open us up from Frank, and then we'll move in. I'll say a few more words about this chapter, and then we'll bring it back around to Q&A and discussion as we go forward. So Frank, please.
Yeah, just to add on to what you were just saying, one of the issues with technology today is buying electric cars. It's not an answer when we have to look at how much of what's needed for an electric car has to be mined, and the ramifications of all of that. Look, the comment I wanted to make was, again, on paragraphs 104, 105, on the technology, and the end of 104, it's extremely risky for a small part of humanity to have so much of this technological power. One of the issues that we debate at the UN, it's because I work in the area of disarmament, or pay attention to it anyway, is the difference, the arguments really between the non-proliferation treaty supporters and those who would do away with nuclear weapons altogether. And, you know, the former argue that there's so many countries that have signed on to the agreement. We see it's not really working, and certainly Ukraine brings a lot of the weakness for that to the fore. But their argument is that it's just not practical to get rid of all nuclear weapons. It's just not going to happen. Whereas those who are arguing for the abolition of nuclear weapons are saying, you know, idealism, yes, it's, you know, but it's the direction we have to be moving in to eliminate situations like we're facing today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, the way that the analysis of the technocratic paradigm and anthropocentrism, and also not just anthropocentrism in general, I'll say stuff about this as we go forward, but as Judy and others have already raised, you know, which humans are we talking about when we talk about anthropocentrism? You know, it's not all of humanity. It's a very small subset of humanity that we're talking about who is guiding the sort of operation of this paradigm. And we have to keep that in mind, you know, and often these are the same folks that, you know, there's profit in, you know, non-proliferation over disarmament. There's money in that. There are resources behind that say, you know, whereas the question that we're really asking is, why should we as the human race, living in creation, living among all these other creatures, recognizing the absolute disaster that nuclear warfare is, ecologically and socially, right, on every single level, why do we think that we need nuclear weapons? You know, I mean, as I think about it from a theological, ethical kind of standpoint, it's very hard for me as a follower of Jesus Christ to imagine any rational, reasonable defense of the idea of something like nuclear weapons, like their existence. And I know that there are lots of political and economic and social reasons people will give, but as Christians, and I think this is kind of, I'll say more about this higher calling idea whenever we talk about anthropocentrism, but I think as Christians, there is always a push toward a sort of more radical higher calling that says, you know, okay, we can understand all of that kind of thing, but we're not living for a world order that needs nuclear weapons or needs this particular kind of proliferation. We're living for a world of peace and justice and equity and love and compassion, because those are the things that Christ proclaimed to us, right? And so if we think back, in many ways, Frank, your comment is beautifully bridges last week's conversation with this one. If those are the resources, as Francis says, that the Christian tradition provides to the conversation, right? That is so important, right? In us thinking about this, and Tom, thank you for that comment as well, right? You know, how we have the historical, you know, precedent leading up to the signing of NEPA in 1970, and thinking through all of these kinds of things as well. So great. So bringing in policy, politics, economics, war, there's a lot here that's really challenging, and I'm excited to get further into it. So let's do it. All right. So I'm going to offer my thoughts at a couple times in this presentation, one, maybe two. I'm going to ask the group to kind of have a quick go around discussion on the theme that we're talking about. So just be ready for that, because I think there are a couple things here that are worth kind of discussing on the spot as well. So chapter 3, we're talking about tonight, the human roots of the ecological crisis. So some of this we've already covered, and you'll hear me kind of emphasize, reiterate some of the things we're saying. And I also want to emphasize and offer my own commentary on some of the ideas that Pope Francis raises as well as we go along. So we get in the very first paragraph, paragraph 101, this great quote, right? A certain way of understanding human life and activity has gone awry to the serious detriment of the world around us. If you ask me what the thesis statement of this chapter is, that's it. A certain way of understanding human life and activity has gone awry. We've gone off the rails to the serious detriment of the world around us. And in order to understand what that sort of awryness is, what that off the railsness is, we need to be able to analyze the human roots, the ways that we and our motivations and who we are as humans are implicated here, you know? And so to start out, I would just emphasize those words, certain way. Francis throughout this chapter really emphasizes that it's not like humanity is depraved and you know, without hope. It's that we are choosing actively to live our humanity in a particular way. Now, the other side of that is that redemption is possible. There is a way of redeeming human life and redeeming human activity that doesn't go awry, that doesn't lead to the detriment of the world around us. And it's important to recognize that from the start, because he's not setting up simply a sort of condemnation of humanity. He's setting up a very hopeful vision of what can be if we learn to live our humanity well. And so that, I think, guides us toward a really important focus on impacts, right? Not just thinking about our intentions, not just thinking about the kind of world we want, but really thinking about, as we saw in chapter 1, you know, what is at the root cause and what are the impacts of kind of the ways that we live. So Francis envisions, right, this root cause as this distortion of the human vocation, a corruption of our understanding and practice. In particular, practice is so important here, of what it means to be human. That's what this chapter is taking on. And so it pushes beyond that surface level analysis, that band-aid solution, which he constantly cautions against. He says, we're not just looking for a solution to global warming or Arctic melting. We're looking for a way to rethink who we are, what we're called to be, and what we're called to do in practice with our God-given humanity and the vocation that God has given us. That's really how deep this analysis goes. It's all the way at that fundamental level of who we are and what we're called to do. So he breaks this analysis down, and I'm going to focus mainly on these two themes, the technocratic paradigm first, and what he calls modern anthropocentrism second. So those are the two big issues here that he's going to talk about. So we've already started to discuss this, so I just wanted to kind of reiterate, right, that before Francis talks about the technocratic paradigm, he actually presents a very positive vision of what technology itself can accomplish, right? He, in paragraphs 102, 103, 104, he emphasizes again and again, there's this whole laundry list, right, of inventions and innovations that have changed the world and changed human life. You know, vaccines and medications, you know, factories that can produce various things, you know, new techniques for doing all these things, which, quoting John Paul II, he envisions as, in paragraph 102, quote, wonderful products of a God-given human creativity. So there's this really positive valuation at the beginning of what tech can do. And he's even positive on the modification of nature, as long as the modification of nature serves the common good and provides what he calls a remedy to evil. So a way of fighting against these negative forces that are at work in our world. He goes on in paragraph 103 to talk about the beauty that technology provides to us. You know, he talks about the soaring skyscraper and all these other things, that our technological innovations give us things that are beautiful and amazing to behold. And in no way is he saying that we need to like let go of that. And, you know, it's like, no, the mountains are beautiful, the skyscrapers are ugly man-made inventions. He's not saying that. There is beauty in everything, because our ingenuity and our technological innovation reveals, again, that God-given creativity, which is sort of the product of our evolutionary capacity and our ability to sort of imagine a better world. So all of that is good, and all of that is valued positively by Francis. But then, and this is where we really started our conversation today, beginning with 104 and moving into 105 and 106, he starts to express concern, even to the point, I think, of expressing alarm at some point, that technology is tied to power, and that power is held not in common, not by everyone, not by all people, certainly not by all creation, but that this power, and especially economic power, is held by a select few, right? Which leads to dominance, as he says, over the whole of humanity and the entire world in paragraph 104. That theme of dominance or domination comes back through. And I think that brings us to the doorstep of the real issue, which he, drawing on his main source, Romano Guardini, names the technocratic paradigm. Okay, the technocratic paradigm. So here, I just want to be really clear that there's this distinction he's making between technology, which is human-made tools to make the world a better place, and the technocratic paradigm, which is a system of power, a system of domination fueled by technology that leads to destruction and exploitation and all these kinds of things. And that distinction is really right there in the word, right? Because it's technocratic in the same way that we talk about democratic, right? Cratic meaning rule by the people, right? Autocratic, technocratic, power, rule is being centered in technology. That's what that suffix gives us. And so what we're talking about is a paradigm in which technological power and mastery become a means to power and an instrument of oppression. It's the ability to manipulate nature, which translates, and this is the important thing that many of our participants have already named, into a concentration of economic and social capital or power in the hands of a few, that allows for the pervasive domination and destruction of the world we live in. That's the technocratic paradigm, and that's what he's concerned about, right? So a question kind of comes up here. Is science an instrument of power and domination, or is it a method of inquiry that seeks to understand the world, and by understanding it, offers opportunities for us to make the world a better place for all creatures? Well, the answer to those, that either or, is yes to both. It can be either, right? Science and technology can be used in either way. To Frank's example, contrast, the possibility of, sustainable agriculture technologies that allow us to farm in more efficient and effective ways that actually work with nature's processes, with nuclear weapons, which simply destroy and poison, right? Both of those are the results of science and technology. So the underlying issue isn't technology itself or science itself, but what we choose to do with it. And that's what brings us to that deeper ethical, moral level that folks were talking about in our introduction, right? There's a great quote on this in paragraph 106. He says, quote, "People have constantly intervened in nature, but for a long time, this meant being in tune with and respecting the possibilities offered by the things themselves. It was a matter of receiving what nature itself allowed, as if from its own hand. Now, by contrast, we are the ones to lay our hands on things, attempting to extract everything possible from them while frequently ignoring or forgetting the reality in front of us." That's the whole quote. Really, really powerful challenge there. And, there are a lot of good paleontologists and archaeologists, geologists as well, who are working on this stuff, who have made this sort of widespread observation that probably the greatest sort of quantum leap, to use that phrase, in human evolution is the moment when, rather than us having to adapt to our environment in order to survive, we became capable of adapting our environment to us, right? It flipped around. Rather than us adapting to the environment, we became capable of adapting our environment to us, right? And this takes the shape of agriculture. It takes the shape of building walls around cities so the bears can't get in, right? Or whatever it is. But that moment when we develop that capacity to look at the world and say, how do I change the world rather than changing myself, right, is a moment of a quantum leap in the development. It's really the origin of technology. Technology is the ability, to do things with the world. And so his concern is that, right, when we look at this, when this paradigm is applied unilaterally across systems and institutions and structures, our society, human life, collapses into exploitation. It collapses into systems of oppression, and it appears often like there's no way out, you know. So the key here that I think he's inviting us to think about, and here I'm going to draw on sustainability conversations a little bit, is that nature's resources are not unlimited, right? And what I would say here is often we make this distinction between non-renewable and renewable resources, right? But even renewable resources take a long time to replenish. And so what people working in environmental science and sustainability are telling us, what ecologists are telling us is, okay, we may need to use wood, or we may need to use water, or we may resources to be replenished at a rate that allows us to continue to use them without eventually using them. Resource to ultimately become non-renewable through overconsumption. But I think one of the ways we tell the story is that, oh, that's a renewable resource. We can use it again and again and again, but there are limits there too, right? And so we have to be thinking about that. And just to throw in a couple ideas from environmental science and economy people, one, the great thinker Herman Daly, you know, frequently makes this claim that the economy, right, our economy is a subsystem of the biosphere, not the other way around. We often think about resources as if they are resources that fuel the economy, right? That phrase, fuel, think about that, like how that's tied to the way we think about consumption and energy. But in reality, whatever our economy is, needs resources. And we can only do so much, because if we don't have the resources, we don't have the economy. The economy collapses when the resources are gone. And there's widespread historical evidence, historians talk about this frequently, that major collapses, like the collapse of the Roman Empire, were accompanied by resource overconsumption. And that maybe it is the case that actually the collapse of many historical human societies resulted with, you know, from resource overconsumption. And I think back to last week's conversation here into the idea of Sabbath that we spent a good deal of time talking about, and how there in the law, right, of the Hebrew Bible, we get these provisions for allowing the earth to rest, right, to caring for it in such a way that that replenishment is possible. You know, and I think there's some real wisdom there that maybe we have lost and that has really been obscured under the sort of operation of the technocratic paradigm. If folks out in the world there are interested in reading more about this, this is a relatively short, great article from Orion magazine a few years ago on sustainability that you might want to check out later on. And it's a great primer in some ways for chapter 4 of Laudato Si too, because the author Eric Zenzi talks about all of these different kinds of sustainability, social, economic, environmental, etc., which are going to also be different dimensions of what Pope Francis calls an integral ecology. So you might check that out if you're interested in it later on. All right, so to go a little deeper here with the technocratic paradigm, this is, the technocratic paradigm is closely related to an important second idea, which Francis starts to discuss in paragraph 105. It's what scholars often call the progress myth, or the myth of progress, okay? And here from the outset, please be attuned to this idea. By myth, he does not mean a made up false story. He's using myth here, or we're using myth here in a technical sense, meaning a story that sets up a world and establishes a certain kind of identity. So a myth is a story that establishes a particular world that we live in, and it in that way gives meaning to our identity. So what does the progress myth as that kind of myth suggest? Well, it suggests that it is the human vocation to manipulate and control, to bend the world and its creatures to our will, right? So that in doing that, we find the fulfillment of what it means to be human. So this is where I think, Maria, the quote that you brought in, you know, it operates on this belief that goodness and truth automatically flow from technological and economic power. that ain't the case, right? That is not the way things are. And we have seen that. Couple examples, well, there's a deep tie here that he doesn't get into in Laudato Si, and I really wish that he did. It's one of these places where if I could have my private audience with Pope Francis, I would say, why didn't you talk about this in Laudato Si? Here's an example of that, that this is tied to Western expansionism, to colonialism, and to racism, all of that. Whenever we talk about lands and ecology and domination, we're not just talking about lands, we're also talking about people. Example of this, especially in the age of debates, around critical race theory and the Black Lives Matter movement, being so serving such an important function in society right now. I always invite my students, and here we are, all students of this encyclical, to consider the fact, I'm thinking of the musical Hamilton here, which I love, to consider the fact that the economic system that Alexander Hamilton, wrote into existence, as the musical tells the story, right, was written in a time when there was slavery, when slavery was legal in the United States. So in some fundamental ways, the way that the US economy is structured assumes that there will be unpaid labor or very cheap labor available to us. Our economic system in part is based on that assumption because the founding fathers, as we call them, they're mothers too that we often forget, the founding fathers didn't know any other kind of world. They too were limited by the world they lived in, and that's a world that had slavery in it. So this idea of unpaid slave labor is there in the foundations of the American economy. So even with the abolition of slavery, even with the developments that we've made, the progress that we've made with respect to racial and social justice and all these kinds of things, there will always be a need in our system for low wage, basically the equivalent of slave labor, in order to drive the economy. And that's fundamentally exploitative. So if we're going to restructure things in the way that Pope Francis is challenging us to do, and to get away, right, from this, and thank you, Bonnie, yes, and women were not counted as people either, if we're going to get away from that kind of foundation and say, no, we want a world where justice truly reigns, then I think we have to recognize that this thing we're calling the technocratic paradigm is just as much an economic, right, structure oriented toward profit and growth as it is an ecological structure or something like that, right? Because as Francis says in 109, within this paradigm, quote, finance overwhelms the real economy, right? When he talks about a real economy, I said I was going to mention this, a real economy would be an economy that actually takes stock of everything that the banana or the iPhone, right, the copper mine or whatever it is, everything that was involved in the production, shipping, labor, exploitation, paying people a living wage, right? Imagine how much a bunch of bananas would cost if the workers who raised those bananas were paid a living wage, one, they were grown using sustainable farming techniques, right? Shipping was accounted for, both in terms of how much it costs to ship things and how much pollution is emitted when things are shipped from Central America, say to Boston or something like that. And then that the people in the grocery store paid a living wage for stocking the shelves, right? All of these factors. Imagine how much a banana would cost if we actually acknowledge that would be the real cost or a real economy analysis of what something is, be paying $7 for a single banana or something like that, right? But we live within this sort of system of expediency and efficiency, but it's rooted in exploitative and oppressive structures. And Francis is not pulling any punches with respect to his analysis that in some ways, chapter 4 and chapter 5 are going to go even stronger at this point. And they made some economists, in particular Catholic economists, a little squirmy when this thing came out, because there's some uncomfortable sort of realities that he's calling attention to there. So with all of this, right, I think the flip side is that there's a call to action here. There is a reflection on what and how we consume that we're being challenged to account for. And there's a recognition of those real costs, right? That those costs are always going to be higher and more costly, not just in a pocketbook kind of way, not just in how much money, right? But also in terms of their ecological and social impacts, and that all of that can be wrapped up in the simple, act of sending a text on your iPhone or buying a banana at the store, and so that awareness is really what he's trying to foster. And so he then concludes, and this is kind of the final point of the technocratic paradigm, that these realities are all evidence, and I think this is so right, that simply put, we haven't been trained to use our power well. We've got all this power, but we're like the teenagers with the keys to the Camaro, at like age 16, and absolutely no sense of responsibility for what it means to drive that car. I remember, the days of driving 120 down some road because it seemed fun. That's kind of how we are with respect to our technology. And too often, I think what he's saying is, and I agree with this, we concede our vocation and our freedom to self-interest and a quest for profit or power, even to violence, at the stake of, or at the risk of violence. Sorry, couldn't get what I wanted to say there. And so he concludes, quote, "We have certain superficial mechanisms for ethics, but we can't claim to have a sound ethics, a culture and spiritually genuinely capable of setting limits and teaching clear-minded self-restraint." There's that category again of asceticism or self-restraint kind of showing up as a solution to this. And so, recognizing that these decisions, as we've already said, that we make about technology, as we make about these, our technology, how these over time, and this is his key point, they come to shape our culture. They come to shape our vision, or perhaps they come to blind us. They come to obscure our vision. We can't see clearly anymore, right? And in doing that, they come to shape how we think about what it means to be human. Who are we anyway? And as Barbara was saying earlier, we've lost the sense of what that truly means. And Francis himself says, paragraph 108, we can't go back to the days when technology was just an instrument, when it was just a tool. That ship has sailed. Technology shapes our understanding of ourselves now. And there's no escaping that. But what we can do is that we can think about it. We can process it. We can reflect on it. We can be discerning. We can do all those kinds of things. And that opens new possibilities, including what I like to call in my classes, the Spider-Man principle. I don't know if anybody's a Marvel fan, right? But the famous line from Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility, right? And it's there in every single Spider-Man movie. The newest one is really great if you haven't seen it, if you're a fan. But whenever we think about these things, right, he says that the outcomes of this would be things like more balanced levels of production, better distribution of wealth, integral human development, and true social inclusion. Sounds pretty good to me. What if we directed our power toward those things? I think that's the challenge that we have to recognize, because we have that freedom to choose. And it's easy to forget that we have that freedom to choose under the pressure of the technocratic paradigm. But that is the really radical point. That bold cultural revolution would be about sort of calling out the operation of that technocratic paradigm, understanding it, and then seeking to transform it, right? That is really what he wants to drive us toward. And he says this means overcoming, quote, unrestrained delusions of grandeur. That's in paragraph 114. I love that. It's pretty true. That maintain the idea that we are not Homo sapiens, right? But we are something like, Homo conquistador, right? We are the human conqueror, the one who is made by God to conquer nature. But of course, as we saw in chapter 2, that's a fundamental corruption of the right Christian understanding of the human vocation. And so that's what he wants to drive toward. So that's the most in-depth thing that I'm going to say tonight on the technocratic paradigm, because I think that he invests so much energy into understanding that and being able to unpack it and see kind of its social implications, the way that it shows up, the way that it shapes us and our understanding of who we are. That's really what that section is driving toward. So that's the first major theme in this chapter. I'm going to turn now to the second theme, say a little bit less about that more briefly here, on this theme of anthropocentrism, modern anthropocentrism. Okay. Modern anthropocentrism, this idea really gets at the vocation piece that we were just talking about. Anthropocentrism, if you haven't heard that term before, I'll type it in the chat so you can see it there, is a worldview that understands human interests and aims as basically the measuring stick for all value. So everything else other than humans is an object or an instrument or a commodity to be used and to be consumed. And things out there in the world are only valuable insofar as they're valuable to us. We decide where value comes from, and it's all based on our humanity, right? So as we said already, we got to ask that question though, what do we mean by us, right? Who is the us that we're talking about? Not all humanity is equal. Not all humanity has equal social and political and economic power and capacities. Think of the people who hold sway, who hold power in church, in society. Generally still in this day, kind of to Bonnie's point earlier, we're still looking at mostly white men, which I acknowledge, I'm one of, that hold this power and this sway in society. And so if we can recognize that again and bring that to our awareness, we need to be able to say, whenever we say anthropocentrism, well, human-centeredness, but which humans? The interests of which humans are being centered here? When we factor in social inequality and oppression, racism, sexism, other forms of marginalization, we quickly see that while all humans may benefit in some way, shape, or form, not all humans benefit equally from anthropocentrism. And we need to be aware of that and really hold that at the center. That's another place I push Pope Francis to go a little further on in his analysis. All right, so that's what anthropocentrism is and how it operates. It centers us and makes us the center of value. Now, there's a bunch of outcomes that he is going to present to the intersection in particular of the technocratic paradigm and anthropocentrism. I'm just going to kind of review them and offer them as things we might discuss. In paragraphs 117 and 118, he connects these ideas with our inability to recognize the worth of a poor person or an embryo or a person of disabilities. And he then says, again, everything is connected. The way that we think about any of those things is connected with the way we think about the earth, is connected with the way we think about birds and water and squirrels and the rights that these things have. The second point he makes is that anthropocentrism, often he's concerned, leads to what he calls practical relativism. The idea that not only are humans the center of everything, but actually the individual's needs and the individual's desires are the center of their own value. So I decide what's good for me. I can choose what's good for me. This makes it really easy, as he says, to throw things away, to participate in that throwaway culture, right? Or to do whatever it is because I'm the center of my own little universe. Now, the flip side of this that I would emphasize is that in a capitalist economy like ours, that's incredibly profitable to companies because it pushes people to maximize their individualism and to want what's good for them and to go out and purchase and participate in the economy in ways that benefits the individual person, right? But what if instead of that being the center of value, we thought about the relationships and the context and that total network, again, the real economy that we're living in. So that's a second thing that he observes as an outcome of this. The third one, which he talks about in 124 through 129, connects these ideas to labor, and I think this is so important, and the need to foster what he calls good work for all people. And he doesn't mean like, good work, buddy. He means like good work, good meaningful work, right, that people have. But he says the technocratic paradigm and anthropocentrism devalue work and workers. What they do, what the technocratic paradigm in particular does, is it makes workers cogs in the wheel of a profit machine, right? Such that, and this is the key point, work serves growth and work serves economic and social progress as they are defined, right, by the power holders, by that select few who are at the top, the rich and powerful, right, rather than serving the common good. And that's the important distinction, because according to Catholic social teaching, work is for the common good. Work is for the people, or the classic way of framing this, right, that economies are for the people, not people for the economy, right? Economies are for people, they're tools, not people for the economy. And so that is really important, that sort of second piece on labor. And then the third outcome that he emphasizes is biotechnology. And this is in paragraphs 130 to 136 at the end of the chapter. And here, he argues that while we absolutely are entitled to use, again, this wonderful God-given creativity, he says, quote, we need to constantly rethink the goals, effects, overall context, and ethical limits of this human activity, which is a form of power involving considerable risks, right? And we got to be aware of those risks. So that's the only way we can use our power well, honor the Spider-Man principle, with great power comes great responsibility, right? And it leads us to take this sort of cautious stance in our decision-making, or at least a thoughtful or nuanced stance as we go through. And, one little note here that he does mention, I want to comment on, he says, the jury's kind of out on genetically modified organisms, GMs or GMOs, that he talks about at the end. And I think this is generally the case. But one of the things that's important to recognize is that GMs are part of the superstructure of industrial agriculture that we talked about a lot last week. And so it's not just GMOs, it's not just about, are they healthy or are they beneficial to humans? It's also about, again, thinking of the real economy, the agricultural practices, the sort of background, what's involved, what kind of pesticides are being used, how much water is being used, all of those kinds of things come up. And when we look at the use of GMO products, we see very quickly that there are deeply harmful practices deeply harmful to the earth involved often when industrial agriculture tends to use GMO products. So that's just kind of a side comment on that. In my opinion, ethically, it is a reason to avoid GMO products and to seek more holistically, sustainably grown and produced things, especially things that are produced locally. If you can go local, that's always the best way forward in sort of my own analysis. So that's that. All right. So we've talked about the technocratic paradigm, talked about anthropocentrism, and we've talked a little about what Pope Francis sees as these outcomes, these impacts and effects of those things. The last thing I want to comment on before we open it up for discussion, and again, if you have comments or questions, feel free to use the Q&A here, is Pope Francis's turn to a solution. And this is where I'm going to kind of start our conversation with a question to the group. So I'll say a couple words about that and we'll open it up. So where does Pope Francis go with this? Well, like we talked about last week, he turns toward what he calls stewardship. And I really appreciate what Barbara said last week, that maybe we might also want to think about solidarity as a possible framing for this. And I contributed the idea of service as something that we might want to think about as an alternative here to stewardship. And this is in 117 and 118. He calls for, a technology that is ethically rooted, that is not severed from ethics, because he knows that if we use technology without ethics, it's just going to be more of the same, and that's the concern. So, well, with that solution in play, I just want to offer a few of my own observations here, which then I think will lead us into discussion. So the first observation I want to make, and I want to make sure this is clear to everybody, that there are a lot of people out there in the world who are arguing, and I tend to argue, to be honest with you, in this way too, that maybe we need to give up anthropocentrism altogether, all right? Francis does not hold that view. Pope Francis holds that there is a good anthropocentrism and a bad anthropocentrism. And we have been living according to the bad anthropocentrism, which he puts adjectives. If you notice this when you read Laudato Si, he always puts an adjective in front of anthropocentrism. It's excessive, or it's tyrannical, or it's exploitative, or whatever it is. He never condemns or critiques anthropocentrism in itself. But a lot of people, a lot of theologians, a lot of ethicists do critique it. And the reason for that is we've seen the historical effects of our anthropocentrism, and the picture hasn't been pretty. So one question we might think about, is there a right way or a good way? Is a positive anthropocentrism possible? I tend to lean toward no. Pope Francis tends to lean toward yes. Maybe that's something we can discuss. Like I said, given history, that's what history shows us. My worry there is that even a good anthropocentrism may only sort of perpetuate the same cycles that we'll find new ways back to the same old bad behaviors, basically, that we've always had. And I might suggest even, and this is a very Lenten thought, since we're here, these waning days of Lent leading up to Holy Week, that perhaps there is a higher calling for the Christian that entails a giving up, an ascesis, right? We would say an asceticism, right? A giving up of anthropocentrism for the part of on behalf of a higher calling of the Christian life. You know, is there an asceticism or a giving up of this idea that we're the center of things that doesn't compromise our intrinsic worth? I'm not saying we need to do that or lean into this biocentrism where everything's equal, but that actually frees us to better serve creation's needs more fully. Can we say, quote, you know, something like this? Sure, we're special, but whatever our specialness as humans is, can only be understood in relationship to the specialness of everything else that God has created. You know, and in that way can be the basis for deeper care and more responsible action. Or another way of putting that more scientifically, we often talk about ourselves as more evolutionarily developed or superior, right? These kinds of things. But what if the right way to understand our evolutionary advantage or development or whatever it is to say, it doesn't mean that we have more power. It doesn't mean that we can do whatever we want. It means that we have greater responsibility because we're capable of critical reflection, unlike what any other animal species is capable of, that the fulfillment of that evolutionary advantage is to use our capacity for a good that's greater than ourselves. And if that is the case, I think that might be a way to rethink and maybe, you know, put anthropocentrism in retirement or something like that for a little while, so that we can see ourselves more radically related to everything else around us. And this is what in my scholarship I call an ecocentric perspective. And I don't mean just an easy sort of like green perspective or a eco-friendly perspective. I mean a perspective that is focused on relationships, on the whole, and the way that every action, every breath we take, every step we take, right? Sting, I don't know, you know, think of that song, like very creepy kind of Sting song, right? Is interconnected with everything else around us, right? And that, like Mary's Magnificat, that this can be directed toward lifting up the lowly. This can be directed toward fostering a greater good, that is not immediately right before our eyes when we're kind of blinded by this profit-driven technocratic paradigm. So that's a question. Is there a good anthropocentrism, or are there other ways of thinking about this that might lead us into the greater depth? And I think no matter where we come down on this issue, you know, Francis says that ultimately it is an adequate presentation of Christian anthropology that's the understanding. We need a new anthropology that fosters this bold cultural revolution and connects us with everything else for the greater good. And in that way challenges, you know, the technocratic paradigm in colonization, imperialism, and recognizes those harms that have been done as a result and really seeks a better, greater good out of this moment. So I think that, in my analysis, is what chapter 3 offers us, what it challenges us to think about. There's so much there, and we raised, you know, I hope that fleshes out some of the things that we raised in our initial discussion and gives us some fodder for discussion. So maybe if I can be, sorry, a little Paulopocentric or something like that here, a little, you know, self-centered here in my question, can I throw out to the room this question of anthropocentrism, ecocentrism, biocentrism? What do you all think? Like, is Francis right that there is this healthy anthropocentrism to be, you know, retrieved and fostered? Or are we better off moving beyond even a positive God-given anthropocentrism and saying, maybe we need a new way to think about what it means to be human? There's no right or wrong answer to this. I already told you what I think. I'm just curious because I wrestle with this, what other people in the room might think. So maybe if folks have a couple of thoughts on that, we can go there, and then welcome questions from the Q&A for people out in webinar land and also for everybody here in the room. So Barbara, start us off. Oh, go ahead, Barbara.
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear.
Yeah.
If I do go by analogy to how people of color would feel toward white people saying, oh, well, we'll just reorder it a little bit and we'll try to do better, I don't think they would buy it if we did the same thing in terms of sexism and institutions that we could name. So I would be very, very hesitant to think that this was our way forward, that we would sort of try harder to be better I don't trust us to do it.
I share your concern. Other thoughts? Yeah, Karen, go ahead.
Yeah, Paul, I thank you for bringing up the concept of, I wrestle with that also, that there can be a possibility of a good anthropocentrism. And I appreciate you using that ecocentric way of looking at it, because as soon as we start to say there can be something good, it's like we're inching our way halfway to saying, well, maybe, possibly. We give excuses for, we try to look at the good points or the good possibilities. And I think we just have to totally step back. It's, to go with Barbara, even just used as an example, to say, like, as soon as we start to say, no, but it's all lives matter, or, we whitewash it. And yeah, and that's what, so I appreciate you bringing that up, and actually challenging what Pope Francis is saying here, because I very much agree with what you're saying here. So thank you.
Yeah, Tom?
Well, as a practitioner in NEPA, and Paul, I brought NEPA up before, as it was signed in 1970. I believe it is a positive anthropocentrism in being involved in the process of public service projects, that if you want funded, you are going to jump through certain hoops to make sure that what you're doing does not violate or puts in balance to the area, the geographic area that you're working in. So as a practitioner of 35 years and working with NEPA and federal and state agencies, they have to do certain things. And if they take woods, they have to put back woods. And they can even identify the ratio they put back. It's all a part of mitigation. And I think we would be far further in an area of where we don't want to be if we didn't have NEPA. And NEPA only came about from serious concerns about pollution and so many other things in the 50s and 60s. And I really believe that there's positive things going on, but we can't allow for the egocentrism of people. And our leadership needs to be one that matches Pope Francis's efforts.
Yeah.
And I love this conversation because it gets to the heart of who we are, and we're not supposed to be looking for short-term results. And we're the ones that put things out of balance. God put things in balance, and now we have imbalanced things to the point of where we aren't smart like God to put things back. But we have to be careful with our decision-making processes. And I think NEPA was one positive step in that direction. Doesn't mean it can't be improved.
Yeah.
But in making more grasslands, more forest, more wetlands, doing positive things as part of a public works project, I think that's important.
Yeah.
And I think it's important that what you're doing, we are doing, education for us, but education for everyone about these paradigms.
Yeah, I think that's so important, because the beginning of consciousness raising, that's what we're doing here, right? And hopefully, we have these resources out of these conversations to not only have our own, consciousness raised, so to speak, but then to be able to talk in meaningful ways, about these topics, and especially with people, to translate them in a different context, to bring them to our schools, to raise awareness. And this is like an anecdotal thing, but the thing I said about the Constitution and slavery and the way that the economic system is structured, with a place for slave labor because of the time and place in which it was written, that came to me out of a reflection on recognizing that, in my 12 years of K-12 Catholic education, you know, we would learn about slavery, but we would always learn about slavery as a thing of the past. And we always learned about slavery and as something that once was, and yeah, it was bad, it was terrible, can't believe that those people did those things, but we're not like that now, right? And I think that there's this sort of thing that hit me in the face one day where nobody ever taught me that, you know, slavery was so economically beneficial. And that's the reason why it originated. And there's a lot of historical analysis on that. So this consciousness raising we're doing is so important. And Tom, to your other point, what you described sounds a lot like what I think ecocentrism is. So I think that that's funny. And I agree, we got to be careful to contrast egocentrism with ecocentrism, this focus on relationships. And I also think, because I don't want my critique to be so harsh that anybody thinks that I am saying, that I think, because I don't think this certainly, that Pope Francis is wrong about this, right? I think that there may be deeper ways, because Tom, what you said at the end there, that if we could bring our corporate and our civic and all of these other dimensions into alignment with what Pope Francis is you know, proposing, we would have a bold cultural revolution. Like, we would start to get there. You know, as a theologian, I always feel challenged to reflect a little bit more deeply and to move a little bit more fully into those ideas. And so this discussion that we're having of anthropocentrism, ecocentrism, other things is meant to invite that kind of reflection as well. Real quick before we go to Virginia in the chat, a great comment again. I think, Deborah, you mentioned this last week too, Native Americans having such a wonderful ecocentric viewpoint, and that there's so much we can learn from them. Absolutely. I'm because of our discussion, I was inspired to reread that book we mentioned, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and I just can't say enough how beautiful she writes, so beautifully. And it's just such a wonderful, engaging book. So invite everybody to read that as well. Virginia, take it away.
I just, like, as you just mentioned, like, I think there's a need for that bold cultural revolution that Pope Francis talks about, and then in paragraph 115, that part where it says that when human beings fail to find their true place in this world, they misunderstand themselves and end up acting against themselves. I think there has to be like an understanding of that, and how, you know, that connection that we all have with each other and how everything affects everyone. And so I think that there's, you know,
yeah, in some ways, again, you know, and this theme keeps coming up. And I think, you know, people read Laudato Si as like the encyclical on the environment, like it's a commentary, right? But really what it is a call to change. It is a call to a reorientation of our perception. And I can't ever emphasize that theme enough. And that's what you're getting at, Virginia, right? It's not enough to say, let's change our practices, right? It's not enough to say, let's just do things a little bit differently. We have to change how we see. We have to change how we see the world. We have to change how we see ourselves. We have to change how we see all of it as God's beloved creation, and enter more deeply and more radically into that truth, which is a truth of our faith, right? The beginning of the creed is the proclamation that God is creator of heaven and earth, right? Of everything, even the things we can't see. And so what would it mean if we actualize that or operationalized that, right? Put that into practice as not just a belief that God made everything, but that there are things we have to do as a result, you know, of that belief. And I think that's the real challenge. We had a comment, you know, talking about, you know, wetlands and things like this, that, you know, we also have to recognize, and I think this is important as we're kind of trying to have this nuanced conversation, that things like mitigation can be good strategies, but mitigation only goes so far. You know, there's also conservation and preservation and all these other strategies that we might look towards in order to have a sort of holistic approach, you know, to how we're thinking about our lands, especially people, because I know we have folks on who are engaged in land management and that kind of stuff as well. So that's key. I'm going to go real quick back to the Q&A, and then I'll go over to Diane here. From Suzanne Barbarese, we have a great sort of but challenging comment that's basically, you know, reflecting on, you know, the fact that I keep saying call to action, call to action, call to change. But the reality is that the systems that are in place, like our local recycling systems and things like that, actually don't even recycle that much in many cases. This is unfortunate, but it's true, and we know it. And you know, we can talk about responsibility, but how do we really get leaders and systems to match Pope Francis's efforts, as Tom was saying a minute ago. My answer to that, I wish I could, like go into a ton of depth, and we will talk about this a lot in week 7 again when we get to the really practical stuff. But what I'll say right now is this. We had those, classic 3 R's: reduce, reuse, and recycle. And recycle got a whole lot of play. Recycle got a whole lot of play, right? Reduce and reuse didn't get as much play. And I think the reason for that, one reason for that, is that recycling still involves purchasing and consuming, right? And so, okay, tell people that they can recycle things, but that's not going to stop them from buying them. Whereas if we had really leaned into reduce or simplify or humility, or something like that, I think it would have been such a different game. If what is it now, 30 years ago now, when, we started regularly to use that slogan, what if we had leaned into reduce and say, hey, everybody, one way to solve this problem is just to consume a whole lot less, Well, that actually is true. But the technocratic paradigm is not consistent with the idea of a sudden rapid reduction in consumption globally. So it may not be a totally, full or comprehensive answer, Suzanne, but one way that I might think about that is let's reimagine the strategies that we use, because rather than sort of saying, we've got a recycling program, we've got this, can we simply say that there is, again, an asceticism or a reduction or a cutting back, and that actually is the best way to do it? Just consume less, find ways to do that, and find ways to buy in ways that benefit a more holistic economy. It's not a full answer or a complete answer, but maybe a start to an answer that we can talk about. Thank you for that. And let's go over to Diane, who's been waiting.
Part of what this is making me think of is you used the example of the banana. I was thinking of there's a Black American, African American, Clint Smith, who is an author and an educator. And he and whomever else have created a series of video clips on Black history and Black American history. And there was one I looked at a while ago on cotton in the economy, and those who picked cotton, where the cotton was shipped, what it did to the economy in England, where a good bit of the cotton went. But it just made me think of relationships. And I think part of learning, however we do it, is always like connecting the dots. It's always about trying to see the relationships. And for me, I always look at that as a learning process. As I, learn from you, or we learn from one another, it expands our understanding, and see how much of it are relationships that I may not necessarily have considered to be in relationship. So I think that's such a richness, and it's always a challenge to me to be open to that. And how we as humans at times still do treat others as objects, not as subjects. And how can we grow beyond that?
It's a beautiful reflection, Diane, and I think you're so right. The growing beyond, what a great metaphor for this conversation, right? The ability to sort of like actually have roots as humans and grow alongside other things and grow with other things in these systems. Karen Kalin in the chat right now is talking about, Kimmerer, again, from Braiding Sweetgrass, this idea of animacy, learning to actually like listen and learn from other species. What a corrective. I think you're right, Karen. What a corrective to anthropocentrism. What if we walked out the front door in the morning and said, I wonder what the tree is thinking. Can I listen to the tree? Can I ask what these species are? And actually made that a part of our spiritual practice, because those creatures are also, beloved of God. And I think, that connects also with something we have from Joan Gallagher in the chat too, which also connects with Carol's comment too. But this idea of moving our worldview from, kingship or power to kinship, right? To relationship, to coming to see other creatures as truly as our kin. And again, here, Elizabeth Johnson, among others, is one of the great figures to read if you want to explore this idea more fully of kinship, with other species, as well as, Sally McFague, Rosemary Redford. There's a bunch of great thinkers on this. And all of this is, I don't want to lose this, also closely aligned with, the great eco-spiritual writer Thomas Berry's, thoughts on the idea that we need to cultivate ways of living in mutually beneficial relationships, as Carol's comment in the chat says, right? To appreciate our global interconnectedness, and to really activate that in ways that makes this sort of shared vision that we're articulating here. Like, we all really care about this stuff, and that is beautiful. And Pope Francis really cares about this stuff, and that's wonderful, right? But to let that vision then cultivate practice and transform the way that we interact with each other and with the whole of creation. I think that's where we're going next, right? In chapter 4, what we're going to read and discuss for next time, Pope Francis is going to present his idea of a paradigm for a solution, on the principle that a multifaceted problem needs a multifaceted solution. He's going to present this thing that he calls integral ecology, as an ecology that integrates all of these factors and addresses them together. So that's what we're going to explore together next. So keep growing this week in conversation with others. And I look forward to growing with you all next week as we reconvene. So have a great rest of the day wherever you are, and take good care. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks,
Thank
Paul.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.